Now let's look at Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu, because again the argument will be that this is a principle in Islam, it cannot be changed. Nobody has the right to abrogate slavery because it's a principle. Now I'm not saying that slavery as a whole will be abrogated, although it has been done on paper. But the idea that the constitution of slavery cannot be altered or changed or even blocked in certain instances, that's what I'm challenging here. Okay? Sayyidina Umar, he ruled for 10 years, between 634 and 644. And he was known as Al-Faruq, okay? The man who can distinguish right and wrong. He had a lot of knowledge when it came to the maqasid of Sharia, which is the overarching objectives of Sharia. What does a law seek to intend to achieve? Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in a very famous hadith, and here you have two of them, Tirmidhi and Hakim, that Rasulullah said, if there were to be a prophet after me, it would be Umar. Okay, so it's been classified as Sahih by Al-Hakim. Al-Dhahabi agrees with it, that's why I've taken it here. Same as at Tirmidhi, it's a strong, and even Al-Albani classified as Sahih, Hasan. So I've taken it as strong. But the point being, his discernment was attested to by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He understood the objective of Sharia, right? So this is not a man you could say he didn't know what the Quran was saying, what the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would have done. He understood. So his reformation of many things, administration, social cohesion, the army, slavery, wasn't just anyone. It was Sayyidina Umar al-Faruq. And I said before, nobody has more ghayra than Sayyidina Umar. None of us could say we have more protective jealousy over Islam than Sayyidina Umar. So what did he do exactly about slavery? Let's have a look. First of all, we have to realize that Sayyidina Umar was not only a leader and a warrior, he was a very, very, very capable scholar, a faqih. Okay? He made a lot of ijtihad. He made a lot of ijtihad. Something that people don't oftentimes look into. He made a lot of independent scholarly assessment and judgment. So he was a man who was known for that, the ability to make ijtihad. And he had a lot of, as you can see here, it says he was Imam al-Mujtahideen, the Imam of the Mujtahideen. Yeah. So it's not just an average human being, an average Sahabi. He was a man in the right position and with the right foresight to understand the objectives of Islam and the ayat and the ahadith and the sunnah. So when he does what he does, we're going to look into it now, keep this in mind. He understood the objectives, he understood the rules, he knew what could be changed and what couldn't be changed. So I have gathered various sources for this, but I'll only be picking a few of them, because there is so much evidence out there, so much information, so much for those who seek the information, it's all out there. But I'll be taking a few of them and giving you some extracts, just to paint the picture. If you want to go into detail, you can do that, but there's enough information there. So here in the book Slavery and Islam, Maulana Said Ahmed, okay, Maulana Said Ahmed, Slavery in Islam, we have on page 169, so here we have abolition of slavery among the Arabs. As he took the reign of government in 634, Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu ordered that the men and women who had been enslaved during the times of Sayyidina Abu Bakr, his precedent, from the tribes who had turned apostate in the wars of apostasy, should be set free. He also gave orders that the people of Arabia should no longer take fresh slaves. Let me repeat that again. When he took the reins of government in 634, this is just literally 14 years, 5 years following Prophet Muhammad ﷺ's death, within 5 years. After Sayyidina Abu Bakr waged war upon the tribes who left Islam, Umar took the reins of government and he freed all of those people who were captured in those wars, Hurub al-Ridda. The apostasy wars, they were all captured as slaves by Sayyidina Abu Bakr. When Umar became the Khalifa, he set all of those tribes free. Furthermore, he gave the order, no more slaves from Arabia, from the Arabs. If that is not manumission and abolition, I don't know what is, quite frankly. If he did not understand the rules of abolition and Allah's hukum, I don't know how you come to the conclusion that you've understood it better. He is very clearly, at least amongst the Arabs, which is why it's not popular. When we talk about slavery, you have to realize there is a tier system amongst the fuqaha. The majority opinion, not by all people, because the literalists, the Zahiri school, would not accept this. Neither will the Khawarij. But generally speaking, an Arab cannot be enslaved as a result of this rule here. Okay, keep that in mind. So if you can abrogate one portion of slavery, then is it an immutable law? Of course not. You've just abrogated something that wasn't done by the Prophet ﷺ, neither by Umar, by Abu Bakr. You've done something that wasn't done by Sayyidina Muhammad ﷺ, neither by Abu Bakr. Right? But it's been instituted in the law, and it's now part of the law. Furthermore, we have another example of this in Ibn Athir, التاريخ الكامل في التاريخ, Ibn Athir. So Ibn Athir, he gives us another example of this. When Sayyidina Umar became Khalifa, he sent the army out to face the Sassanid Empire. So this was the preamble to 𝗾𝙗𝗚𝗏. So he sent Muslim emissaries to go and speak to Rustam, who at the time was the general in charge of the Persian army. Various Sahaba were sent to speak to him until they sent Al-Mughira ibn Shu'bah al-Thaqafi. So he was sent to speak to the enemy camp. So when he goes to speak to Rustam, one of the things he says to him, "We used to hear a great deal about your wisdom, the Persians, but I have never seen any people more foolish than you people. We Arabs do not enslave one another." Let me repeat that again. We Arabs do not enslave one another. This is in Al-Kamil fi Tarikh Ibn Athir. During the reign of Sayyidina Umar ibn al-Khattab, you can see at the bottom of the page here, 169, Umar ibn al-Khattab. So when he came into position of leadership, he made it illegal to take Arabs as slave in the Jazeera. He did not stop there. Just to drive the point home, he did not stop there. What does he do next? He says, well, release of the slaves of Jahiliyyah. So Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu also gave instructions about slaves of pre-Islamic era who had found the Islamic period. So in other words, somebody who lived as a slave before Islam but was in Arabia, even they had to be freed. Right? That they should pay their masters for their freedom. This meant that even where the master did not consent, he didn't want to sell his slave, the slave be considered makatib. In other words, somebody who is now given the right to buy his freedom. Sayyidina Umar, he enforced that. You can find this in Shibli Nu'mani al-Faruq, the life of Umar the Great, but also slavery in Islam, Maulana Sa'id Ahmed, and also Ibn Athir, Al-Kamil fi Tarikh. So there is the evidence right there. Why are we talking about immutable laws when we've seen already in the first century, within about 5 years of Rasulullah passing away, Sayyidina Umar, of all people, not just a major Sahaba and a ruler, is ruling no more slavery here, at least not amongst the Arabs. I want you to think about that. Did he not understand the ayah? Did he not understand Allah's will for eternity? He understood, we've outgrown this. We've outgrown this. And he gives us further reasons as to why he was against this. And in particular, bringing slaves to Medina. He forbade that as well. Radiallahu anhu. Alright? So abrogation of slavery. So again, we've mentioned that. He gave orders that no longer taking slaves from amongst the Arabs. He paid for the ransom of those taken by Sayyidina Abu Bakr. And he ordered that those who were slaves before Islam be granted the right to have kitaba. These are major steps, if you ask me. Within 5 years, these are major steps. Okay. So then we have the prohibition. Sayyidina Umar made it prohibited to bring slaves or fresh slaves into Medina. Did Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam say that you couldn't bring slaves to Medina? Umar did not give permission from conquered regions, permission to enter Medina, the capital of the Khilafah. And this is in Al-Khulafa al-Rashidun, this book here, Dr. Salih Abdul Fattah al-Khalidi. So this is a book on the Rashidun Khilafah, and this is the Arabic. So all the references are there. Sayyidina Umar did not allow for the newly conquered people to be brought into Medina as slaves. He forbade it. Furthermore, when they were brought to Medina, he sent them back. He sent them back. So the second part is Umar reluctantly gave permission to some of them to settle in Medina. And what he expected her to came. So effectively, although he gave the ruling, there were some people saying, well, they can become Muslim. They can become Muslim. And he was right, because who killed him? 𝗵𝗡𝗏𝗡𝗨𝗔𝗟 al-Majusi, a Persian slave. He was right. So his firasa and his ability to, he was right. That's how he came to his death. He was killed by a Persian slave. Although the general rule was, he said, I don't want any slaves, any fresh slaves coming to Medina. And all the Arab slaves, free them. Right? So this is solid evidence. This is solid evidence. But it doesn't end there. He continues. Sayyidina Umar in Al-Bukhari, he has a chapter, Al-Bukhari has a chapter on the prohibition of taking dhimmis, Christians and Jews, as slaves. Umar says, radiallahu anhu, I remind you of the responsibility of Allah and His Messenger concerning the dhimmi. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani rahimahullah says, in interpreting this hadith emphasizes that even if a dhimmi, a Christian or a Jew who lives under the Muslim protectorate, were to violate the terms of his oath by fighting against the Muslims, so in other words, he goes and he joins another army and he fights the Muslims, such an individual will still not be permissible as a slave. Fath al-Bari, which is the explanation of Al-Bukhari. These are solid evidences. These are solid. So Sayyidina Umar effectively was taking us to the level that Allah had already given us an injunction towards, the highest level. He's taken us there within 5 years of Rasulullah passing away, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So the idea that this is a law we found, we had no intention of changing anything, this is complete dishonesty. Let's put it that way. But it doesn't stop there. He continues, radiallahu anhu. Umar ibn al-Khattab also legislated. He's legislating so many things, right? To liberate slaves, to prohibit slaves, to give them more rights. Why? He understood the maqsood, what is intended by this rule, was temporary. Umar legislated, again, he made it law, الشروط العمرية, that Muslims were not permitted to sever the ties of kinship between a slave mother and the offspring by selling one to one master and the other one to another master. So I'm going to give you a hadith here. This is where ijma' comes into it. I've given you Quran, I've given you hadith, I'm giving you ijma' of Sahaba. Selling slave women during the time of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Jabir ibn Abdullah narrates, we used to sell our slave women and the mothers of our children, 𝗲𝗏𝗡 al-Waldina, our children's mothers, when Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Prophet, was still living amongst us, and we did not see anything wrong with that. So in other words, as per the argument, Rasulullah did not abolish concubines when he died, so you were not allowed to abolish it. So in this hadith, Sunan ibn Majah, Jabir ibn Abdullah says, when the Prophet was alive, we used to have slave women and they would have children with us, but we would sell the mother and keep the child, or sell the child and keep the mother. And the Prophet was alive, he did not prohibit it, and we did not see anything wrong with that. Then he died, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, nothing changed when he died. He didn't have a final ruling that you can't do this. Umar becomes Khalifa, radiallahu anhu. What does he do? So let's look at Sahih al-Albani, Abu Dawud. The same narrator who narrated the first part of the hadith gives us another hadith saying to us, things changed. We sold slave mothers during the time of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Abu Bakr. When Umar was in power, he forbade us, and we stopped. Ijma'. So the question now is, has Umar invented something that Rasulullah and Abu Bakr did not actually put in law? And why did the companions, when he says we, he's talking about the Sahaba, we stopped. Why did they not say to him, you are making bid'ah and you are forbidding something that was allowed in the time of Muhammad and Abu Bakr? Why? Quite simply because things had changed. It wasn't a pillar of Iman. And Umar, being Al-Faruq, understood, ultimately speaking, we have to outgrow this. Islam gave us the incentives and the direction. Now it's us. Now that we have an empire that's growing, let's outgrow this. He forbade it. And the same man who narrated the previous says, we stopped. Is he forbidding something that Rasulullah allowed? Think about that. Right? Does he stop there? No, he doesn't stop there. Sayyidina Umar continues, radiallahu anhu. He also legislated that slave masters should give kitaba. Kitaba is a contract of manumission. A slave can apply to be free. So they have a contract with the slave master. And he says, I will pay you to allow me to go free. Both of them agree on the price, and the slave works his way out of slavery. There was an ayah in the Quran that mentions this, but Sayyidina Umar made another interpretation. The same ayah that talks about giving slaves kitab if they demand it, Sayyidina Umar, he interpreted it in a form that makes it compulsory. Alright, so the way he interpreted this ayah is that it is compulsory, that if somebody asks you for freedom, you give it to them. So, I mean, there are so many examples. I don't want to bore you with back and forth, so many examples. So many examples. Right? Sayyidina Umar continues. He doesn't stop. He doesn't stop. This is clearly an effort, a concerted, clear-cut effort to cut this out altogether. He's making an effort to cut it out altogether. He's using Quran, Ijma', and the Sahaba around him are not challenging him. They're not challenging him. So during the reign of Umar ibn al-Khattab, the Muslims reached the various regions in North Africa and the Levant, Sham, Syria, Egypt, and Iraq. However, despite the vast influx of new subjects, historical records evidence very few incidents where slaves were taken from these regions. That's another thing. Islamophobes talk of Muslims going around conquering to take slaves, and unintelligent Muslims support them and say, yes, we did, we took many slaves. But the historical record says no. The policy at the time was not to take slaves. Under Umar ibn al-Khattab, it wasn't to take slaves. He didn't want the slaves. He didn't want the slaves. He found them better as citizens in their own land, paying taxes and working the fields, rather than coming to Medina as slaves. So the idea that we went around conquering, taking more slaves, is completely ahistorical. I don't know why a Muslim would want to promote that anyway in the first place. So the only city where slaves were captured in significant numbers was in Caesarea, where Al-Waqidi reported up to 4,000 captives. Umar allotted them to the orphaned children amongst the Ansar and appointed several as public administrators and scribes. That's the only incident where they took a significant number of slaves, but those taken were given to children effectively as trusts. It was a financial investment for their future, and also employed in the administrative functions as scribes and administrators. Umar made a covenant upon the people of Samarra in Dar Abbas, in Shiraz, and he says they will neither be killed nor will they be enslaved. It was a covenant he gave those people. Point number 9, Amr ibn al-As conquered Egypt, radiallahu anhu. He contracted a covenant wherein the following terms were also granted under Sayyidina Umar. The women and children will not be sold into slavery, neither will they be kept as slaves. Subhanallah. And Islam didn't come to change things. Subhanallah. This is quite novel to me. It's quite different for how things are typically done when empires take over. Point number 10, and this is all, by the way, Futuh al-Buldan, al-Baladuri, one of the most famous books on conquests. Al-Baladuri is mentioning these things. These are solid evidences. Number 10, some of the fallahin, the farmers, the peasants in Egypt, were captured in Egypt, and they were brought back to Medina to Sayyidina Umar as slaves. He ordered that they be liberated and returned back to Egypt as tax-paying citizens. He had foresight. He understood, look, to have slaves, first of all, we have the population of Medina is going to be a minority if we start bringing in all these slaves. We're going to be a minority. Secondly, there's a greater utility. These are fallahin. They work the land. They are farmers. What's the use of having a farmer in Medina as a slave when he can be a farmer in Egypt, cultivating the land for the ummah and paying taxes as well? I don't want slaves. Send them back. Let them become free citizens in their land, paying taxes. This is foresight. This is intelligence. So when the prisoners came to Medina, Umar ibn al-Khattab returned them to Egypt. They became dhimmi, like the cup. So in other words, he said, go back and be citizens. We don't want slaves here. Al-Baladuri, Futuh al-Buldan. So, I mean, and this is just a drop in an ocean of information, quite frankly. A drop in the ocean of information. I could have gone into details. The question now is, did Sayyidina Umar go against the Quran, against the Sunnah? What gave him the rights to do this? Furthermore, when he died, were these rules turned up? No, they were not turned over. So many books of fiqh today will say you cannot enslave an Arab. There's no change to that rule. Neither can you sell a woman who you've had a child with, although technically, according to the Sahih Hadith, it was done in the lifetime of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he died, and it was still the same rule. And Abu Bakr was a ruler, and it was still the same rule. Omar changed it. So has he changed the Sunnah of Muhammad and of Abu Bakr, or did he not understand the Quran at all? Do you understand it better than he did? All of this is in the wrong dimension, because these are things that can change. Sayyidina Umar, for example, another example, the 8 categories in the Quran for those entitled zakah includes mu'allafat qulubuhum, those whose hearts are inclined to Islam, people who may become Muslim if you help them out. When Umar became Khalifa, he said, no more. We're going to cancel that category because we don't need to appease to anyone anymore. We're a power. We don't need to appease to people to become Muslim anymore. So we no longer give zakat to those people. Did he abrogate the Quran? These are things that have to be understood, really. Instead of bullying Muslims into accepting your version of Islam, otherwise they are rejecting Allah's hukum. Look at the history first and foremost. Study Islam and then come back. These are things that are under the category of mutaghayyirat. They can change. It's not essential to your iman to have a concubine or a slave. It's not essential. And Sayyidina Umar, he did so much. Again, you will not find somebody in history outside the Islamic tradition that did so much. In the first 5 years to 15 years, he did so much. And all that information is available for you to read if you want. So let's look at concubines now. Now let's talk about the stagnation of the Muslims. So having gone so high up the moral peak, Sayyidina Umar dies, radiallahu anhu. We then have, shortly thereafter, the Umayyads come into power. We know, we've studied the Umayyad Empire. We know the Umayyads, right? But things go down again, they regress. So let's look at examples in Islamic history where we went so high, and if we continued going up upon the same path of Umar, radiallahu anhu, we'd be in a different position. But we went the other way. So let's look at the other way. And how Islamic was that? Here we have some of the most predominant forms of Islamic slavery, or Muslim slavery, I should correct myself, practiced by Muslims throughout the ages. Following the time of Sayyidina Umar, radiallahu anhu, we have, of course, the Mamluks in Egypt. These were Caucasians, effectively. This was Rustam Raza. Actually, he was the personal Mamluk of Napoleon when he came to Egypt in 1798 to 1801. But he was already there. So these were people who were enslaved for several generations, and they served under the Abbasids. Okay? It's a military form of enslavement. So this was something that developed under the Muslims, with the Abbasids especially. Then we have As-Saqaliba. As-Saqaliba were effectively the Slavs, the people in those regions of Eastern Europe. Again, the Abbasids took many of them slaves. As-Saqaliba were taken as slaves and traded amongst the Muslims. Again, this is something that was done, and we cannot deny it. Then we have the Janissaries. The Ottomans take over, they have their own form of Saqali, but the Janissaries, which was established by Murad II, Sultan Murad II. This is Ataturk, dressing as a Janissary. But that was another military unit that was established for the Sultan's benefit. Likewise, he also had, and they were effectively raised as children to serve the Sultan effectively. And this was done effectively on an industrial level. How halal is that? How Islamic is that? Taking Christian children from their families and forcing them to convert to Islam and to become soldiers, cannon fodder. I'll leave that for you to figure out. Then we have the concubines of the harem and the guards. So the Ottomans again brought about, although there were concubines and harems under the Abbasids, the Ottomans perfected the craft. So again, Eastern Europeans, by and large, these are our real concubines and real guards. So the women would come from Eastern Europe, and the guards were Africans, sub-Saharan Africans, who were actually traded by other sub-Saharan Africans. So this is the most infamous slave trade in history, who supplied the Ottomans and the Europeans and the Arabs all the slaves they needed in Africa. Why did the Ottomans have black guards? Very simple. It was an early form of DNA testing. So if the guard were to be a white European slave, he could also effectively have relationships with the concubines, the thousands of them, and the king or the sultan would not know whether this was his child or not. But if by any chance, even though they castrated these people, they were castrated to make sure that they do not indulge, but even if by any chance something happened and the child was miraculously born, immediately could be seen it was the son of one of the guards. He would be mixed race. That was the reason why they chose black guards to guard the white concubines. An early form of DNA testing. Okay? Now, how halal is that? We know in Islam it is actually completely haram to castrate people, but it was widely spread amongst the Ottomans. And how were these women captured? Not all of them through war, I can guarantee you that. So again, you could see that the desires of man precedes the injunctions of God, whether we like to accept it or not. Then we have the Barbary slave trade. That's another story altogether. Okay, that's another story altogether, where Europeans were also traded by the Barbary coast piracy. So that's Algeria, Morocco, and parts of Libya today, which were under, some of them were under Ottoman control, or partially under Ottoman control, not Morocco, but they worked together to actually intercept European ships, British, French, Italian ships, and to travel across the coast of Europe collecting slaves. This lasted for 200 years. So we can see, and none of this, by the way, is legitimate slavery, Islamically speaking. If we take Islamic injunction, none of this is legitimate, but it still happened. But it still happens. So again, the nature of man, his greed, his lust, overrides whatever was given to him in Quran and Sunnah, right? We have to accept that reality. So here we have an example, the infamous, very famous Baltimore is in West Cork in Ireland, where these effectively these Barbary pirates went and took the entire village as slaves. It was in June 1631. Very famous, by the way, very famous. Okay, this is the it was a sea-coast town, not village, sorry, and they came and took the entire village. Now, admittedly, the village was only about 100 people, so it was a small number of people, but they repeated these attacks. Sometimes it would be in there was a region in Malta known as Gozo, the island of Gozo. The entire island was depopulated because of this sort of piracy. Okay, it is estimated that up to 1 million Europeans were stolen this way through the 2 centuries preceding. So this was something that was done illegally because they were just going in raiding and taking, raiding and taking. Right? So we have to accept that. Now, the Barbary slave trade actually is interesting because there are books written by survivors of this. There's a very famous book by a man known as Thomas Pellow. Thomas Pellow from Cornwall. He was captured when he was 11 years old, and for 20 years he served as part of the Muslim army and traveled with them, and eventually found his way back home to Cornwall. And there were many others. I mean, it became such a problem that the Church of England had to have donation collections to free slaves in North Africa. It was such a problem they had to collect money in order to free slaves. And the British, French, and Italians would send successive ambassadors to deal with the local Islamic rulers to get some sort of agreement as to when they can actually release slaves and how much for. So this went on for 200 years. The Americans eventually also got dragged into it because these pirates went as far off as the New World. They traveled all the way up to, and they started taking people as well, bringing them back to North Africa. So about 1 million people is disputed, but this is the closest estimate given, that approximately 1 million to 1.2 million Europeans were taken as slaves in North Africa. Now I'll ask you this. Is it possible that all of these people were taken legally, Islamically? The answer is no, because it was clear piracy. They were just effectively going across the coastal regions of Europe, the Mediterranean and Europe, and as far off as Iceland and Norway, and just effectively raiding villages in the sea coast and taking them back to be sold effectively as slaves. The local rulers also were complicit because they received a share in each slave. So these, what they used to call privateers, were effectively bandits for hire. And so the local rulers would use them to intercept ships from the Italians and the British and the French, and they would share the loot, right? So it was a mutually beneficial trade in human beings. Ironically, however, because sometimes when people talk of this and they point fingers to the Muslims, they don't tell you that the chief captains, especially in this island here, this story of Baltimore, was a Dutch man himself. His name was Jan Johansen. He was a Dutch man himself. And he became Muslim, by the way. He was captured as a slave. He was a victim previously. Then he became a complicit participant. Then he became a captain, one of the most famous and richest privateers. So there were many Europeans. Some came voluntarily later on and offered their services. So oftentimes you hear, the Barbary slavery and the Muslims, they don't tell you, they remain silent. Many of those who were at the forefront were Europeans, either converted to Islam or just came to offer their services for a hefty return. So it was quite an interesting, not interesting, but quite, you could say, a very diverse lot. But effectively that lasted for about 200 years. When Napoleon comes to Egypt in 1798 and he defeats the Mamluks, then he stays for 3 years, was the beginning of the end for the Barbary slave trade, effectively. The Americans also came, and the British came, and the French came, and they bombarded them. They bombarded them to submission, and that was the end. The French settled in North Africa, and that was the complete end. They actually effectively secured that region, and there was no more Barbary slave trade. I believe that was in the year 1816, around that time. So that was a part of history that we have to also acknowledge and study and realize it wasn't Islamic at all. It was actually financially lucrative, and it continued so because it was financially lucrative. Likewise, you have images here in 1909 of the Ottoman harem and the eunuchs who guarded the Ottoman harem. You can see here. These were real slave systems that survived to the 20th century. Are they Islamic? Again, I'll leave you to figure that out. Then we have the supplier of all of these, most of these slaves. 𝗃𝗡𝗃 is the most famous slave trader after Mansa Musa. So single-handedly he managed to own 10,000 slaves for his private collection. He had 7 plantations which were all manned by free labor, so he became extremely wealthy. He also worked with King Leopold, and worked with various British envoys who came to exploit the local resources and people. He was an enabler. He was a most, you could say, prominent feature when it came to slavery and enslaving the people in East Africa, in Zanzibar and in Kenya and in Congo. He was a Muslim, as you can see here. So 𝗃𝗡𝗃, his name was actually Hammad ibn Muhammad, and 𝗃𝗡𝗃, there are various theories as to what the name meant. Some people say it meant, when his guns, he went in search of slaves, it made this noise. That's what they call it, 𝗃𝗡𝗃. Another theory is that it meant, 𝗃𝗡 meant in the local language to gather. So he was somebody who used to gather slaves. Either way, it was a nickname given to him, and he became the most notorious slave owner in history, only after Mansa Musa. So here you can see him sitting down with some of the British emissaries that came to visit. They came to him for slaves, and he sold it to them. He was born in 1837, died in 1905, sorry. And here you can see him again sitting with one of the colonialist slaving clients, and he is the one who's selling them. So again, you have to acknowledge these things. David Livingstone, the famous British traveller and adventurer, even he was repulsed by 𝗃𝗡𝗃. He went to visit some of these plantations, and even he was repulsed by how 𝗃𝗡𝗃 treated people and the sheer magnitude of his operations. He couldn't believe it. Leopold then, of course, Belgium, goes to Congo. We know what happens there, right? They begin to take locals. Again, illegally, these are free people that are being enslaved in order to work, to take rubber, to gather rubber, and to take the resources in Congo. Who supplied those slaves to Leopold? It was 𝗃𝗡𝗃. It is said 𝗃𝗡𝗃, actually, he supplied up to 100,000 slaves. If you take all his deals combined with his different partners, up to 100,000 slaves went through his hands. And he kept the Arab slave owners in Oman well stocked. He kept the Belgians well stocked, and he kept the British well stocked in their local regions. And Leopold was a maniacal, an insane maniacal slave owner. He had quotas for slaves. If they did not meet it, he would cut their hands, cut their limbs. So you can see a little child here, they made the quota for the day, hand was cut off and a leg was cut off. Then he would have the women in the village to take the heads of slain men, slaves, and to skin it open, to skin the flesh, and he collected the skulls as a trophy. So his enabler, his partner in business was 𝗃𝗡𝗃. So if we want to revive slavery in a modern age, and we call it an Islamic principle that we have to revive and keep alive, these are the sorts of people that we want to effectively bring back to the Ummah. It's not something to be proud of. Joseph Conrad, in his famous book, The Heart of Darkness, talking about Congo, the main protagonist, it is said, was based on 𝗃𝗡𝗃. The merciless slave trading owner was modeled after 𝗃𝗡𝗃. I would really encourage all of you to look into 𝗃𝗡𝗃. You can see in London, in 1889, he's being honored. London Times, front page, 𝗃𝗡𝗃. When he dies in 1905, he leaves behind him an autobiography that he wrote himself in the local Swahili, I think it's Swahili language, which was translated by one of his European colleagues into English, German, then English. So if you want to read from the man himself, the book is available, The Autobiography of 𝗃𝗡𝗃. And he was a prominent figure internationally because he helped them gather slaves and supply the slave stock. So again, for the Muslims who feel pride and who insist on slavery, this is the sort of role model that you should be looking up to. As I said before, slavery was perfected by Mansa Musa. That's different in the sense that he was a king. He enslaved his own people. It doesn't justify it. But when he went to Hajj on his famous pilgrimage, he took 12,000 slaves with him. And this is not to count those who he left behind in his kingdom. So he's known as one of the greatest, I say one of because I don't think he was the greatest, but this is what's reported, the greatest slave owners in history. Okay? In history. Second only by 𝗃𝗡𝗃. So then we have the issue of, right, so what did Muslims say about this? Because this is clearly un-Islamic. Did all the Muslim scholars remain silent? No. Many have written extensively against this. And one of the most prominent ones who lived in Timbuktu was a famous 𝗲𝗲𝗂𝗏 at-Timbukti. 𝗲𝗲𝗂𝗏 at-Timbukti al-Masufi, a very famous scholar in Timbuktu. And he wrote extensively when it came to slavery in West Africa, because there was at the time a tradition of taking only the non-Muslim slaves to begin with, right? The non-Muslim Africans as slaves. But then as time went by and the demand increased, primarily from North Africa, Morocco, they began to take anyone, Muslim and non-Muslim. It doesn't matter anymore. It's a slippery slope. If you allow it for one group of people, eventually the demand outgrows the supply, and you find the general rules become lax. Anyone can do now. It doesn't have to be in a war situation. We just find anyone. So he was fighting against that in West Africa and writing fatwa, and also countering the influence of those who were under the influence of Aristotle, who were quoting Aristotle and saying they were natural slaves and they are African people. So he had to write against other Muslim scholars, telling them, no, this is not true. And the only way you can take somebody as slave, black, white, or green, is through war, not through raiding. So he began to write, and he wrote extensively about this. But again, it's a testament that not everyone agreed to it. It was an issue. But unfortunately, as I said before, the pen of the scholar in this regard is weak compared to the pound or to the dollar of the slave trader. Okay? So they can write as much as they like, but the reality is, when it comes to the crunch, people do what benefits them the most. So slavery persisted, illegal slavery persisted, despite all of this scholarly work happening in the background. So now we get to the point of talking about concubines. Now, this is going to be sensitive, so I'm going to keep it as mild as possible, but I'm going to be very direct and honest with you. I'm not going to lie to you. I believe you've had enough of the lies already when it comes to this issue in public spaces.
Welcome to HistoryUn, the world's leading online learning platform specializing in Islamic history. To discover the HistoryUn mobile app and participate in regular live and interactive seminars and tune in directly from your handset from anywhere in the world. Enjoy instant access to a growing catalog of on-demand streaming content exclusive to the platform, accessible from a variety of devices including desktops, tablets, and cell phones. Connect instantly with our global community of history enthusiasts via our private community forum. To find out more about our online history programs and